Thank you for having me at the for the users group. I'm honored to be here. I know some of the other speakers, and being mixed in with that group is definitely humbling. So thank you. Um, so let's start off with the hashtag Our Giants Are Female. A few weeks before Sari approached us to do a presentation, I had read about Frances Allen and her recent passing. I believe it was in early August. And I was very impressed by her accomplishments, specifically the area where she encouraged and mentored other women. To me, that's near and dear to my heart. As a principal engineer, I've got a lot of experience, and I enjoy sharing that with my junior colleagues. And I've done that at previous companies with college interns that I've had, sharing my experiences, and then hearing back from my college interns on their experience in getting a new job, thanks to the experience they had with me acting as their mentor. So it's a humbling thing, and very impressed with Frances's background and her ability to do that with women in the field of technology. All right, onto the presentation. So we're going to talk about custom step types and how you can use them to personalize your TestStand application. So first, just a brief word from my sponsor, Bloomy. You kind of see that we're a NI Platinum Alliance partner, and our team of engineers and certifications. So today we're planning on both Grant and myself, Jim, to present, and unfortunately Grant had a scheduling conflict, but basically the presentation you're going to see today was a presentation that Grant gave at NI Week, I believe in 2017. So Grant's our Chief Technology Officer at Bloomy. He's been there for 13 years. And I started July 13th of this year at Bloomy, and I'm a principal engineer there. I have over 20 plus years of TestStand and test automation. So quickly, the agenda is number one, if you were hoping for a detailed step-by-step presentation on how to create TestStand custom steps, well, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I just don't have enough time to go into that detail at this presentation. However, on the last slide, I will provide several links that cover these fundamentals, so you'll have some good references. So instead, the presentation is going to focus on a brief introduction to the TestStand custom step types, why and when you should use them, some common application of custom step types, and finally some tips on making the most of your custom step types. And the whole intent here is, after you're done going through this presentation, you'll have some appreciation for a custom step type, so that when it comes time for you to develop or use them, you'll have a better understanding. So just to kind of begin and set a foundation, as most of you probably know, TestStand comes with a bunch of built-in step types already, such as numeric limit tests, and you can see the whole list there on the right. But what we're going to focus on are the custom step types. So TestStand provides this capability, and basically these are user developed, and typically they have a wizard-like configuration dialog, and that's kind of represented over here in the upper right-hand corner, that little screenshot, and we'll get into more of that in some of the upcoming slides. Typically, they're going to call a specific module or a module that performs a very specific and unique function used in your test sequences that can't really be integrated well into the built-in test steps. So at a high level, kind of an anatomy of a custom step type, the screen's kind of depicting some of the major features of a custom step type. While built-in step types have similar properties and features, custom step types really allow you to customize or edit these properties. Also, probably the most unique feature of a custom step type is that box down in the lower left-hand corner, referring to the sub-steps. And again, we'll get into this more in upcoming slides, but just to kind of give you an idea here at a high level of what a custom step type consists of. So in a little more detail, the next several slides will go through those 4 boxes that we just looked at. The step data, basically in a custom step, you can configure or set up unique variables, containers, etc. for your step. And then for step properties, this basically is showing you screenshots of the many step properties that you have in a custom step type. So starting on the left, here you can designate an icon, the step name expression, the name of the step. I'm sorry, the step name expression and the description of the expression, as well as you can select an adapter type, but we'll get more into that a little later. You can also set up in the center screenshot window, you can also set up some default pre, post, and status expressions. And then finally, over on the right-hand side window, you can disable properties. So if you don't want a user to go in and say, edit the code module of your custom step, you can check that off. So there's a number of, a lot of properties here that you can really tweak and customize for your test step, for your custom test step. So looking at the sub-steps, these are, again, unique to custom test steps. And on the right-hand side of the screen, I'm kind of showing the properties and the execution order of a TestStand step. So starting from preconditions all the way to post actions, main module is in there somewhere in the middle. What I've tried to do is highlight the orange, in orange, the sub-steps that are unique to custom steps. So this is kind of giving you an idea of where they're executed. In this case, the pre and the post sub-steps are executed prior to and after the main module, respectively. In addition, you have an edit sub-step, and that's not really run at execution time. It's a sub-step that allows a user to kind of interface and configure your custom test step. So there's a lot of power here, and these are quite commonly used. The example here is from one of our Bloomy, one of our custom step types that we use as part of our hardware abstraction layer. So custom step types are pretty common. You may have already used them and not be aware of it. So they're used as a, well, for pre-TestStand 2016, it was a property loader was a custom step type. IVI functions are custom step types. Pickle steps that are provided are custom test types, as well as extra putty and these can all be added in to your TestStand application. Some of these are by third-party companies, and others are by National Instruments themselves. And at Bloomy, we actually use custom test steps, like I mentioned earlier, as a basis for our EFT module, which is a product for TestStand. And I'll provide a link on the last slide where you can learn more about the EFT module. So why would you make a custom test step? Well, now that you know a little bit about what they are, there's three main reasons. First one would be to simplify. So simplify the task of creating a test sequence for your test sequence developer. So this can be in the form of an intuitive custom test step that performs a specific function. For example, if you want to take a voltage measurement using a DMM, you can develop a custom test step to perform that. Or it can provide a user-friendly interface to enter the test step parameters of your custom test step. And we looked at that in the edit sub-step. It also provides a way for you to standardize on the use of your custom test steps versus a sequence developer writing, say, a new code module to perform a specific task. And finally, the optimization is that your sequence developers can simply drag and drop these custom test steps into the sequence without really having to plug in or call up any additional code modules for this step. So, so there's a lot of benefits there to a custom step. And when should you make a custom step? Well, obviously there's a balance that you need to weigh off, because you're going to spend some significant time developing the custom step. So you need to determine, is that time really going to work for me going forward, where if I'm using this step over and over again, then maybe it's worth to develop a custom step. So for me, when I've developed custom test steps in the past, like my rule of thumb is if there's a certain function that you want to perform in your test sequence, and maybe it's a specific module that you've already written, a LabUVI, that if it's something that's core to your test application that you're going to use over and over again across multiple products in multiple test situations, then it's probably worthwhile to spend the time and develop it as a custom test step. Because what this will allow is it will fit into your step palette when your sequence developer or test engineer is developing the test sequence. They can simply drag and drop that test step into the sequence without having to, like I said, call up another module, or in this case, you might think, well, let me use just a regular built-in, say, numeric limit test step, and you drag and drop that step in. Then now you need to call the module, and you need to know what module that is that you need to use. So if you have a clearly defined custom test step, again, example, if you want to do a DMM measurement or voltage measurement, you can simply drag and define that custom test step, build it, and then your user can drag and drop it into the sequence. So some of the common application of custom step types. So referring to the action engine front end, and this is probably one of the more powerful features of the custom test step. And again, it's related to that edit sub step where it allows the end user to configure that custom test step. So you're just going to expose those parameters for your custom test step in that edit sub step. And this would be an example here, these two GUIs that you would pop up. So you don't have to worry about the user in a typical built-in step when you're calling a VI. They would have to go in and enter in each of these parameter values. So using the edit sub step will automatically fill in the values that are most pertinent or that are going to be configured and changed the most often, while you can kind of default a lot of these values within the custom step. And then you have some of the advanced TestStand interactions. So you can use it to create custom UI messages, such as what you're seeing on the right. This is part of the Bloomy EFT module, where you can actually pop up an image with a user message or an operator message. My personal experience, I use custom test steps to take a bunch of legacy code from a former company that I worked at, and I took their legacy code and basically broke down that code into the different test functions that were being performed. And I basically wrapped those into a custom test step so that now the test sequence developers had a whole library of the test functions that we had been using at that company to test our products, and they can drag and drop. If I needed to do an audio measurement or execute a voltage setting, you can simply drag and drop these steps across. So it made it a lot easier for the sequence developers to develop the sequences. It's much more intuitive. And then another area, again, a high-level architecture where we're actually at Bloomy, we're actually using this again in our hardware abstraction product to it allows us to use custom test steps to configure the instruments in our hardware abstraction layer. So we'll go through some of the guidelines now on the custom step type. So, we'll look at it from these different perspectives. So practical, as I mentioned earlier, you can save some significant time if this is a step that you're going to use over and over again. And as I mentioned, will it make developers' lives easier? So in other words, is it something, again, we use it, you simply drag and drop from your palette into your sequence, and it's already set up with a few little minor configurations. And as it says here, not every code module should be a custom step type. So there may be instances where you want to use a template instead of a custom step type. And the template is basically just using a built-in, an instance of a built-in step that you can drag and drop in from your template palette. So you can get away with that. Whereas the custom step type, typically it's designed around a unique function that you're going to do in your sequence, and you can wrap it in a way that makes it easier for the sequence developer to use and implement. So intuitive, again, it says here, want to reduce ambiguity. So you only want to show that pertinent information, and that gets back to that edit sub-step where we're only going to display those parameters that are really relevant and most important to the user to set up when they're configuring the test step. And you can also use some of the pre-existing conventions, such as the standard variables and drop-down boxes. So it makes it's still, just because it's a custom test step, it follows a lot of the same features and functions as the built-in test steps. So it becomes intuitive to the user. And then as far as accessibility, it's going to allow the programmatic access. So you can store, as I showed you earlier, creating these specific variables for your custom test step versus using like a flattened string data where the information is kind of just not quite as well accessible as it would be if it's a standalone property or variable. So deployable, we use packed project libraries for the source code inside the that's going to be used within the custom step type, the modules, and then you also build these into the TestStand public directory. So you're going to use it. You're going to put it into the type palettes or the step. I'm trying to remember exactly the directory name, but again, all of that is loaded into the TestStand public directories. And then you can use installers to deploy that. And maintainable, you do need to, one of the challenges with custom step types is you do need to put a lot of upfront thought to that step. And I'll get into that in the next slide. Where you need to consider going forward if there are going to changes that are going to be made, that they're forwards compatible and that you don't break anything. I'm sorry, backwards compatible, so that you don't break anything. So on that, this is kind of my brief list on creating a custom step type. And there's other references that I have in a couple of slides. We're actually moving along pretty good here. So things to think about, right, is the scope of the test step function, right? You want to keep that scope within certain boundaries. You don't want the step to be doing multiple things. You're going to take a DMM measurement, you take a DMM measurement, and you feed those results back to TestStand to let TestStand use its limit features to determine whether that measurement is a good measurement or a bad measurement, whether it passes or fails. And you want to also consider what type of information, data, is the custom step going to return? Is it going to be returning a numeric variable? Is it going to be returning a waveform? Is it going to be returning a string? So a lot of that's going to help you to determine how that step is architected. And it kind of jumps a couple bullets down here. with, I mentioned numeric or string, you can actually, when you're creating a step type, you can actually combine it with an existing built-in step type, or you can create a completely new one from a blank piece of paper. So I've done both. I typically have combined them in the past. So in other words, let's take as, for example, the DMM, where you're just returning one numeric variable and you want to do a limit test on that, then it might make sense to build that custom step from a numeric limit step and then customize on top of that. So I didn't mean to jump ahead there. And then finally, another important thing to think about is how will you, or what is the data you're going to expose to the sequence developer? So again, let's going back to the DMM or any sort of custom test step that's going to interface to an instrument. Typically, when I've developed these, the handle for the instrument that that we pass along when we're interfacing the instrument, that's something you probably don't want to expose to the sequence developer. You can build that into your custom step because you're probably going to know what the reference is to that instrument. So there's no need to allow the developer to go in and select which instrument he needs to connect to, because he might select the wrong instrument or the wrong reference. So typically I've hidden those in the past versus, the data that you might want to expose. Again, how are you going to configure that instrument? In a DMM, you might want to be telling him, am I going to do a voltage measurement or a resistance measurement? What's the field or the measurement range that I want to set it to, and so forth. So keeping those features or those thoughts in mind, then you want to start to edit and create the test step. And you're going to do that basically in a type palette. And you can create your own type palette file, and you'll do this through the TestStand sequence editor. So in the type palette file, as I already mentioned, you can create a new custom step or combine it with an existing step type. From there, you're going to add your data variables. Once you've built that up in the type palette, then you can start configuring the step type properties. And we saw that in an earlier slide where we had the screenshots of all those, the window with the multiple tabs across with all the properties. So there you can set up your icon, your step name, the step description, the menu name where it's going to appear in the step palette window. So again, my experience, using an icon, I think is important, especially if you have a group of custom step types that are linked together as, it's kind of maybe a library of, I don't know, it could be a library of analog interfacing to a DAC card. So you might have an analog output custom step type. You might have an analog input custom step type. So you might want to give those a unique icon so that visually it's easier for the sequence developer to look at that palette and then kind of drag and drop. And then once it's in the sequence too, you can kind of see more clearly where that custom step is. And then also you want to determine what sub-steps are you going to use. Are we going to create and edit sub-step? And my experience is majority of the time we are using that property in a custom step type. And then you can use either the pre-sub-step or the post-sub-step. I'll get into these in the next slide a little bit as far as how and when they should be used. But typically, NI is recommending that the actual code module that's going to execute in sub-step can be placed into either one of these. NI doesn't recommend to use the main module in a custom step as the place where your code should reside. That main module or the main code module should be called from. You typically want to do that from the pre-sub-step and post-sub-step. That's what NI is recommending for best practice. I've done either, and I haven't seen too many issues doing it either way. And then finally, you want, I'm sorry, is there a question?
Sorry, there is a question posted by Shri, which is related to substeps. So do you have tips on debugging substep code? And I mean, is that something you're going to cover in the slides coming, or don't know if you had an answer for him now?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? It's kind of breaking up a little bit on me.
Oh, sorry. The question is, do you have any tips on debugging substep code?
So, yeah, there is, in the next slide, there is a little, I do touch on that a little bit. So it's a good question. You can't debug substep code. Well, you can't step into substeps when you're actually executing the step. So the recommendation is to kind of put a breakpoint in the code, and then when you're executing, you should be able to, I believe it will step in there and break. In the past, when I've worked with some of these substeps, I've tried to, well, like I said, in my case, I was converting some legacy VIs into substeps. So it was fortunate that the VI was almost a standalone where I could kind of execute it, or maybe I had to put a like a setup and a close VI around them just to test it. So I would typically try to test it as a standalone VI before I actually plugged it into the custom test step. And again, in the next slide, I'll touch a little more on that. So once you've kind of set everything up inside the type palette, obviously you can save it. And then the other thing you need to consider is if there's any custom step data variables in your test step, you just need to make sure you include that if you want to include them in the test report. And I believe that's a property on the variable that you can set to just say include in report when you're setting them up. So yeah, so on the debugging, the recommendation is to open the VI first and set a breakpoint. Personally, I have not done that in the past. Like I said, I've typically tried to debug the VI as a standalone before I plug it into the substep. But obviously, this is a way of doing it once it is plugged in. Other things to consider are making sure that you close any references within your substep or within the custom step. And then the comment about the API, if you're not familiar with it, then maybe avoid using it. But another an important tip is to make sure you use the TestStand modal dialog and termination monitor functions, so that if a test operator that's running the sequence obviously hits terminate or wants to stop execution of the sequence, that will notify your custom step that event has occurred, and it will stop executing. Versus if you don't include those in there, then obviously the sequence or the step will continue to run, and then you're going to get into a nasty situation where you're probably going to have to abort the whole process. So coming up to the last slide, and these are the references that are really good, actually. So I would recommend looking at them in this order. The first one is a really good example from NI on creating a waveform custom step type. So this takes you through those infinite gory details of how to set up a custom step type, and it's a very good tutorial. And then once you're kind of familiar with that, there was another document written up on best practices, and this was written up by, I think, one of the former TestStand program managers a few years back. And I noticed it's been updated recently, and there's a lot of good information. Goes into a little bit more detail of some of the things I covered in this slide, but there's a lot of good information there. So again, referring to that first reference, that's going to get you the fundamentals. That's going to take you through the step-by-step process. That's a pun intended, of creating a custom step type. And then, you know, you can look at the best practices. And finally, a little plug for our Lumi EFT module, but there's some good information on our website, I'll be honest with you, on what this module is, how we use custom test steps to create, how we use them to create this module. So it gives you a practical example of an application of custom test steps. So that's pretty much everything I have for the presentation. So I'm not sure how we're doing for time. I think we're probably doing okay. If there's any questions, more than happy to take any questions.
There was one comment, I think, from Matthew. It was there also exists on new step that allows you to do some step-on-step instantiation. I think you showed that on one of your slides anyway.
Okay.
I don't know if you can hear me. Here's Matthew.
Yeah.
It just for information, because I only use it in one of our products, TS Plus. I work for Musilog, and this product was developed before, I guess, before Loops was in the native type palette of TestStand, and using the on new step, we were able to get a kind of loop with a start loop and a loop next. So when instantiating, when you instantiate a start loop, it allows us to automatically generate the next loop, so the end of the loop in the sequence. These steps was where this mechanism, this kind of loop, were doing what stuff that is now possible with the streams in TestStand that are new streams appears in I don't believe the latest version 19, I guess.
So I'm not sure if I quite understood your question.
I mean, we use on new steps sometimes to sort of pop up a dialogue. I mean, I agree that you know, so you could copy and paste some step, and then based on whether the data is available or not. I mean, so it's kind of a data validation. I mean, if there is a problem with the data that's in there, or if it is a completely new step, then it pops up. Otherwise, it just you know, accepts the values that it's got. So that's one way we use it.
Okay, if there are no other questions, so thanks very much, Jim, for the presentation.
You're welcome.